We said we would start at 11:30, and it's a little past that. So why don't we gather? And John, thank you for being with me this morning. We're so glad to have you. I gave a very inadequate and brief little snippet of your career, but would you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and where you've worked?
Okay. Well, I was a career Foreign Service officer for almost 40 years, and one of the things that Foreign Service officers do who work for the Department of State is serve in our embassies abroad. And my particular specialty early in my career was as a consular officer, and consuls are those in our embassies abroad who issue passports to Americans and look after American citizens abroad, and also issue visas to foreign citizens who want to visit or immigrate to the United States.
So, John, you were responsible for deciding, in a sense, who could come into the country then?
That's exactly the case. And in the course of my career, either I individually approved or supervised the approval of over 400,000 immigrants to the United States. And that was because I directed our largest immigrant processing centers in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, the largest in the Western Hemisphere, and in Manila, Philippines, the largest in Asia. And that's the greatest source of immigrants to the U.S. today, Latin America and Asia.
So you can see why we thought he might be qualified to talk about immigration. Thank you, John.
Sure.
So a lot of what we hear in our day-to-day media is this sort of feeling about being overwhelmed, that the country is overwhelmed, and then there are different philosophies about what to do with the overwhelmed. One is prevent anyone from coming, and one seems to be let everyone come in. Right. Could you unpack for us a little bit about what's really going on? Are we being overwhelmed, for one thing? And then, if we are, what should we be doing about that?
Well,
and
first,
remember to speak very slowly, okay?
Okay, yeah. First, I want to ask, does anyone remember the killer bees? You remember? They were in South America. They came from Africa. They went to South. They were moving their way up through South America, Central America, Mexico, and they were coming. And they made a couple of horror movies about them. You know, they were going to take over our beehives. The European bees were going to be annihilated, and we don't talk much about the killer bees today. They arrived, they integrated, and they're producing honey, and they're in short supply. So I think the way, based on my experience talking to immigrants throughout my life, both ones applying for visas and others that I encountered, is they come for two reasons. They come for economic opportunity and personal freedom. The freedom to practice their religion or to express their political ideas or cultural ideas, and as I said, for economic opportunity. And that's been true since the Mayflower. What is going on today is sort of the culmination of an inability of the United States to figure out how we are going to meet the needs for additional workers in the United States. And there's been a political paralysis on this. And just to sort of give a little bit of history, you know, up until 1924 or so, pretty much anyone could come to the United States. But by 1924, we had eliminated the possibility for Asians to immigrate, and we had severely restricted immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, where at that point most of the immigrants were coming from. But the important thing to remember is we never did anything about the Western Hemisphere. There were no limits on immigration, temporary or permanent. If from Canada and the Arctic Ocean to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina and Chile, you could all come. The only thing you needed to do to stay is show that you were self-supporting. And so why, with this wave of sort of anti-immigrant feeling about 100 years ago, did it not impact the Western Hemisphere? And that's because there had been a tradition for decades of labor moving back and forth the border, particularly the southern border, and from the Caribbean to the United States, where people would take seasonal jobs. And many of them, if for some reason they were invited to stay and work permanently, all they had to do is show they were self-supporting, usually by having a job. And this remained the case until 1965.
So, John, can I
Yeah,
stop
sure.
you? So in you said
Yeah.
20, we stopped letting, you said Asians in.
Yeah.
Why? What was
Well,
going on?
Asians were a little earlier, and that had to do with Asian labor, particularly from China, immigrated to the West Coast to build the railroads and, to work in other areas because there was a labor shortage. And by the 1880s, there was a reaction to this. And there was the feeling that these people were so different, they couldn't fit in, they were alien cultures, they were inferior. And so we barred Asian immigration and made them ineligible to become citizens. So if you were Asian, you couldn't become a citizen either.
So
even
it
if you were
wasn't that
here.
they weren't doing their jobs
No.
or providing labor that we
Right.
needed. It was just fear of being different, basically.
Fear of being different, yes.
Okay.
And so then the same phenomenon by 1924, we had tremendous immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Now, earlier, the immigration came from Northern Europe, from Scandinavia, from the British Isles, from Germany. But with the immigration coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and especially in very large numbers, we had about 1 million immigrants come to the United States in 1921. At a time when the U.S. population was only about a third of this. And there was this reaction, hey, this is too much, we can't handle it. These people are too different, they have different religions, they speak different languages, and instead of being, white Protestants, they were sometimes darker-skinned people, and they were Orthodox, and they were Catholic, and they were Jewish, and this created a reaction. And so Congress severely limited new immigration from Europe, basically giving quotas. So if you were from, they looked at the census of 1880, and they said, we will all allocate immigrant visas according to the number of immigrants present in the United States in 1980. And of course, these new immigrants had come since then, so that they got minuscule quotas, even though the demand was high, and countries like Germany or Great Britain, which were no longer sending many immigrants to the U.S., were eliminated, were given quotas that they didn't fill.
Interesting. So there's been this interesting dichotomy in the history of this country that we are made up of immigrants, that they bless us and that they bring us great resource and wisdom, but yet we're also afraid of them, and we don't feel like we can take too many of them.
Well, yeah, I mean, the new waves, because over our history, the people who are immigrating have changed with circumstances in the world, and each new group is different than the previous one. And
Sure.
so that creates for some people, I guess, a certain nervousness and a fear of something that's different, that people are speaking a different language, practicing a different religion, eating different foods. As time goes on, all of this gets incorporated into our culture as they do. But in the initial wave, some people become uncomfortable with this.
So tell us about the southern border today.
Okay.
What's happening? We hear a lot about people coming up. Should we build walls? Should we block them out?
Okay.
Tell us about that.
So I told you, till 1977, anyone from Mexico, Central America, Canada, who wanted to immigrate to the U.S. just had to get a job. After 1977, we applied a system of preferences that favored those people with close relatives, and those people had professional job skills. And that was fine. But we still had farms that needed workers. Our economy began to change in the 70s to a service economy, and whole classes of new jobs. I mean, the hospitality industry expanded dramatically. Agriculture continued. We had new institutions like nursing homes, hospitals grew. All of a sudden, we had a need for, I think it's unfair to call it low-skilled labor. These jobs require a lot of skill, but they're not professional jobs. And yet there was no legal opportunity for people to immigrate, to take these jobs. But it was a period where we had very minimal border enforcement. And so people came over and employers were happy to hire them. And that continued up until the present. Now, what began to happen in the mid-90s is that we tightened up our border, and particularly after 9/11, we made the border a lot harder to cross. So migrants who were coming back and forth with seasonal agriculture or other reasons decided this is getting too difficult. I'm just going to have to stay. And they brought their families. And so we had, from the late 90s through the early part of the century, an accumulation of people who were working in the country but had no legal status. And so these numbers, prior to this surge at the border, got up to around 12 million or so.
That's a lot of people.
There's a lot of people.
And they
yeah.
used to be able to work here legally, but we changed the rules.
Yeah, the people from Western Hemisphere, as I said, until 1977, if you got a job, essentially you could stay. And we changed that rule, and we favored high-skilled workers or professional workers. But our economy needed all these unskilled workers. And the other part to remember is that although we made our laws against undocumented migrants stricter and stricter, we had very weak enforcement of those laws and essentially minimal, if no, sanctions on the employers who hired these undocumented workers. Now, theoretically, there were things you had to show documentation you were entitled to work, but, you know, somebody walks into this slaughterhouse and gives a social security number and some plastic laminated card. The employer, who's desperate, says, this is fine, you know, come on, welcome aboard.
So there was this dichotomy between what we needed economically and what we were allowing, which then, so in a sense, we created a whole class of people who weren't allowed to be here, but yet we needed their labor.
So this is the dilemma. So we created, you know, we offered jobs, and we welcomed millions of people to the United States to take these jobs. We allowed employers to hire them. By the way, the employers paid Social Security taxes on those employees because the sanctions of employing an undocumented worker were minimal. Nobody ever suffered consequences. But if an employer failed to pay Social Security taxes on that wages, they went to jail. And we just had 2 roofing contractors in Jacksonville who are doing jail time in federal prison now because they were hiring illegal workers, but they didn't go to jail for hiring them. They went to jail because they did not pay. They paid them under the table in cash. They did not pay their Social Security withholding, either the employer's share or the employees, and that's why they went to jail. So the ironic thing is that these employees are all enrolled in Social Security. They're all paying taxes, but they have no legal rights.
So they're contributing economically to the culture by paying taxes and Social Security, but they're technically not allowed to be here.
Oh, and not just contributing, they're vital to our society. I mean, bedpans in nursing homes aren't going to get emptied. Meals aren't going to be prepared. Hotels are going to have to shut down. I mean, there are construction. Has anyone had to have a roof put on in Florida? There are no native-born workers putting roofs on in Florida. You know, the hurricane damage we had in the Gulf, they are all migrant workers.
So why won't we just let them be legal?
This is a great question, and this is something that we've been dealing with politically for over 20 years. There have been people who say exactly, well, you know, this is a crazy system. We got to normalize this. And others say, well, we have too many foreigners here. You know, we got to stop this. And this is wrong. Our country is changing. We're losing our country. It's the killer bees argument again. And so you have these 2 opposing poles. And there will be, then have been periodically over the years, a number of legislative proposals that, you know, let's try to normalize the status. And those, and usually it's a compromise, so not everyone gets included, but a lot of people do. And so the people who want to restrict immigration saying, absolutely no, how can we legalize anyone when we've got all these millions of people who've come over and flouted our laws? And the other side says, well, you're including some people, but there are many other deserving people you're not including. We're not going to vote for this bill. And time and again, I've seen, this happened several times during my career, where it came to the point where there'd be a vote and both extremes, pulled against the middle and the legislation failed. So
nothing gets done.
Nothing gets done. So what's happened? By 2017, there was the realization in immigrant communities, many of who were divided families. Moms and dads had come up from Central America or Mexico. They were living here. And there was the hope that somehow something would normalize their status and they could bring their families. Kids are home with grandma or with aunts and uncles back in El Salvador or Dominican Republic or wherever. And the reality hit. In 2017, we had an election. Donald Trump was elected. That there was no way we were going to have legislation that would accommodate these people here. And people gave up waiting for a legal solution. Advocates of immigrants developed a strategy that said, well, just walk up to the border and declare political asylum or request political asylum. Now, this had never happened before. Political asylum was something that happened if say a student or someone temporarily in the U.S. experienced a situation where they felt they couldn't go home. I mean, many Chinese students after Tiananmen Square say, I can't go home, and applied for asylum in the United States. And we're allowed to say. And every year, about 50,000 people were approved for political asylum, plus others were overseas, were approved for refugee status, about 100,000 a year. But when this movement started up to the border and people started applying for political asylum, it totally overwhelmed the system. So the initial reaction of the government was that send them all back. You can't apply for political asylum. And so this was appealed to the courts, and the courts said, no, you have to give them due process. But the administration was faced with the reality that there was no way that they could process this number of people. And so they just let them in. And then we had the pandemic, of course, and it shut down things for a while, both because we were returning everyone and because during the pandemic people weren't traveling. And we didn't have the jobs. I mean, people were getting laid off. So migration stopped during the pandemic. Of course, after the pandemic was over, what happened? We had this tremendous need for workers. People started coming again. And again, we had a change in administration, and they were applying for political asylum. We still couldn't process them. And so we were admitting people. Now, what you see here is two things. We have three branches of government, but when one is paralyzed, the other two start acting. And so we have the executive branch making policies, and the courts intervening and say, you've gone too far, or haven't done well enough. And so this is why we have this sort of paralysis now, and we get pushed back and forth, by decisions in the courts or by new presidents who have different policies, and it's kind of crazy.
So in a sense, we're seeing with immigration the same as we're seeing in a lot of government function, which is we can barely function
Yes.
because we can't
Right.
seem to get along.
Like our budget, which
Yeah.
we just went through. So yes, I think we are facing a paralysis. And the irony is, I think in the issue of immigration, and I think we have a lot of public opinion surveys that show that most Americans are in the middle. I think that there's a sort of the 70% compromise that would satisfy most Americans. But the problem is, the ones who make the most noise are the 15% on either side of the middle. And those are the people who contact our elected representatives.
So, John, this notion that we're going to be overwhelmed, I've heard the image that we're in a boat and we can't let very many people in the boat or we'll sink. Do we have too many people here and no jobs for them? Is that true? What?
Well, we certainly have plenty of jobs. I mean, anyone who's been looking at the economic figures lately realize that we have the greatest shortage of workers in the United States compared to jobs available in my life. And so there are a couple reasons for this. One, that all the developed countries are experiencing a demographic change. We are not reproducing at the levels necessary to sustain our population. The US is not as bad as, say, Japan or Spain or Germany or Italy because we have immigration. But if it were not for immigration, our population would be declining. And of course, this impacts the ability to fill jobs. And so these immigrants are essentially sustaining our economy by filling jobs that otherwise would go empty and resulting in an economic contraction in the United States.
Questions? Mitzi? Let me bring, oh, yeah, hold on one sec. We're going to bring you a microphone because we've got people listening online. Thanks, Nancy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Hi, my background, and I'm Mitzi, by the way. My background is I am Filipino. I immigrated in 1972, and just like you said, we're in the Manila, Philippines. People go through the consulate to come over. And typically, you know, the breadwinner, who was my father, preceded us by about 2 years. He had to wait 10 years to get an interview at the American Embassy for a work visa. And then after coming here, he petitioned for the rest of the family to join him. And that was the typical pattern of not just me, but a lot of Filipinos, as you would be well aware. The situation I now find being talked about in the southern border is worlds away from what I experienced. My worry is that it's not just pure economic opportunities reasons or personal asylum reasons. There's now another overlay where the immigrants or refugees are being used as pawns in the drug trade, cartel operations. So how do we account for that in policing our border?
Well, this is something you hear on the news all the time. All these migrants, they're bringing in drugs. Well, that's not true. If I were a drug trafficker, the last person I would pick would be an undocumented migrant because they're too unreliable. You know, I lived on the border. I lived in Ciudad Juarez and managed our consular operations there. If you imagine the Rio Grande River at Ciudad Juarez in El Paso, which is on the other side, it looks like the traffic going across the St. Johns River on the 5 bridges every day in Jacksonville. There are thousands and thousands of cars, and there are, you know, big, 16-wheelers, and they're taking goods back and forth. And so the volume of drugs is the physical volume of a drug is very small. And the tactic of the traffickers for many years has been they put a little bit in a few of these cars or trucks, a couple kilos here, a couple kilos there, and they just play the odds because they know that not every single car could be stopped. Can you imagine if they tried to stop every single car truck coming across the St. Johns River and to, you know, tear it apart and examine it and bring in drug-sniffing dogs? There'd be no traffic. And yet this border is vital to us. Our industry applies, our logistics, depend on it. So no, the way the drug traffickers move drugs across is they play the odds. They send shipments across among these thousands of vehicles, sometimes without the drivers even knowing. The truck driver has no idea that there are drugs in there. Most of the time they don't know. And they know that 99% of those shipments will get across. And so that's what's happening with drugs. It's not, I can't say that a migrant has never brought drugs, but that's not the way drugs get into the United States. Yeah. Okay.
And I was also 15 years at JIADF South Drug Task Force subsequent. How do we get the word out to America, particularly for Central Americans? How do you get the word to the Americans, particularly about Central America? Most of those people fear for their life. When we were successful in Colombia in contracting the drug trade and the cartels, and the Mexicans were quite successful actually in Mexico, it's a balloon. You squeeze this and you squeeze that and the air goes to the middle. And so all the cartels moved much of their activity to Central America, which historically the United States has, we've done everything we can to not foster democracy in Central America. From our multiple invasions throughout the 20s and 30s by the Marines, or we called it intervention, the CIA intervened in Guatemala in the 1950s.
Well, let me try to answer this. I spent my entire career, mostly in Latin America, trying to do things to stop drugs from moving to the United States. And I came to a conclusion that nothing keeps an addict from his drugs. I mean, we have drugs in our prisons. And so the wisest thing anyone ever told me about drugs in the U.S., drug consumption, is that drug consumption is a pediatric disease. It is a disease that starts when people are in young adolescence. And the people who sell these drugs, or for that matter, tobacco, know that if they can get someone hooked at that age, they have a lifetime customer. And so I looked at the armed forces and said, how did they deal with drug addiction? Because in the 70s, drug use was rampant in the armed forces. They did universal drug testing. And so you knew if you wanted to join the armed forces, you couldn't take drugs. And if you did take drugs, you were out. And, this is a whole different conversation, what to do with drugs. But I do not believe immigrants or foreigners are responsible for our drug addiction problem. It is Americans. We're taking the drugs. And until you find ways to help people avoid taking these drugs, we're going to have this problem.
Ben.
Just a quick one on the drug issue. I read this book a few years ago, the title, Why America Gets High. And it was thoroughly researched all the way back to the Puritans.
Wow.
Okay. So the reason why the drugs come to the United States is because we want the drugs.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Now the other question about refugees and immigrants. There's a difference in the way the government treats them. There's a difference in the amount of money that we spend. Now, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and they're still there, we're bringing tons of Ukrainians into the United States. We're expediting the process of them becoming citizens. A bunch of them live in the apartment building that I live in.
Wow.
And a bunch of them aren't working, but they're being subsidized by the government. Now, with Afghanistan, we were there 20 years, spent $2.313 trillion. The idea was to get Osama bin Laden, we did that, but to empower the Afghan military and their government. When we pull out, they will be strong enough to run their government. The strategy was not, when we pull out, we take all those people we empowered to bring to the United States.
Well, I think, Ben,
let me finish.
Sure.
But see, that's what we're doing. And now we're blaming whatever administration is in power for the way that it's being handled now. whether it's Trump, whether it's Biden, or whoever. So tell me the difference between and why we treat the Afghans, Ukrainians that we bring here, we vet them expeditiously compared to the people at the southern border. Now, I understand that there are 42 people from 42 different countries at the southern border trying to come in.
Thank you,
So
Ben.
just expand on that a little. If you
So, well, this is a complicated thing. Let me just try to reduce it. When we look at the southern border, you know, Dean Kate asked me to join a group of Episcopal clergy that went there in 2018 when we had our initial surge. And we found that virtually all the migrants came from 3 countries. They came from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And as they crossed the border asking for asylum, they were met by good citizens and who tried to help them. And what the migrants needed was a shower, a change of clothes, and help getting to the bus station or the airport so they could join family members already in the United States. So virtually 100% of these, that in 2018 there were about 1 million people who came across, were going to a destination where someone would house them, would find them a job, get the kids in school, and these were family members they were joining. And that continued, but these countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, they're small countries. I mean, El Salvador has only a population of 8 million people. 25% of the people born in El Salvador are now living in the United States. So there's a limit to how many people could possibly come. But what happened is, as people realized around the world, because there's a great latent demand to go to the U.S., they realized, hey, all you have to do is get up to the border and say political asylum. And so what we saw is people from other countries in Latin America, from South, Brazilians, Peruvians, Ecuadorians, and the Venezuelans. Now, the problem, especially with the Venezuelans, is there was not a big Venezuelan immigrant community in the United States. They were dislocated because of the difficulties of the government of Venezuela, the wrecked economy, and of 24 million people in Venezuela, about 6 million became refugees in Colombia and other Latin American countries. But things were tough in those countries for them, and they saw other people going to the United States, and they thought our life would be better if we did. But when they got across the border, they had nowhere to go. And that is why we're now seeing this problem of homelessness, because they're going where maybe cities offer housing to the homeless. And housing is the big problem now for all the refugees. They can get jobs. They can't get places to live.
Interesting. Can you give us, do you understand, Ben was referring to the difference in treatment between Ukrainians and Afghanis. Where does that stem from?
Well,
What's the rationale?
when the war started in Ukraine, the government said that any Ukrainians in the U.S. could stay until things calmed down, and that we would allow Ukrainians to come here for up to 2 years to get away from the war. And these were women and children for the most part. Now, lately, the administration has extended that to Venezuelans, Cubans, another big immigrant group. 230,000 Cubans walked across the border last year, and to people from Nicaragua and Haiti. Now, these are some of the countries producing, but it's the same kind of system. You need someone to sponsor you. If you have somebody who sponsor you, give you a place to stay, then we will take up to $15,000 a month. And that is actually working now, and particularly effective with the Cubans. We have far fewer crossing the border. With the Venezuelans, again, they know fewer people here, and it's not necessarily allowing this new program to take up the numbers of those who were just crossing the border. And as far as the Afghans, we had a program, we still have a program, it's worldwide, that says if you work for the U.S. government overseas as a foreign citizen and you serve successfully for at least 15 years, you may immigrate to the United States. You may request immigration. Worldwide we had a few thousand a year, maybe 5,000. But as things began to wind down in Afghanistan, we said, well, okay, all these Afghans who work closely with the U.S. government, you can immigrate. But in the chaos of the end of the former government of Afghanistan, many people got left behind. And the vetting process has bogged down, just as the processing for political asylum. There's a complex vetting process that goes on for anyone, particularly from countries in the Middle East and countries where there's a problem with terrorism. And that has backlogged many of these people.
Yeah. Jay, I saw you had a question.
I was just wondering, could you repeat what you said about which countries are now allowed to immigrate into the United States? Did you say Honduras and Venezuela and...
Well, it's not that they're allowed, it's that the mix of people who are showing up on the southern border has changed. Initially, it was the Central Americans who were migrating to join their families for the most part. Mm-hmm. There have always been Mexicans, but the Mexicans tend to come up and work and go back. But what we saw in the last year and a half or so is people coming from many other countries in the world. I mean, in addition to elsewhere in Latin America, Venezuela, Brazil, Peru, people are coming from Eastern Europe, from India, from China, because the perception is all you got to do is get to the border and you can get in, as opposed to, this lady who said she waited 10 years for her number to come up, or her dad did, in order to get his visa to immigrate to the United States. If the belief is that, well, if I got to the U.S. and I could just get across that border, I could change my life, let's give it a try. And that's, to a large degree, what's happening right now.
So just one thing I wanted to add in the perspective, I have family in Venezuela, and a lot of the surge in the Venezuelan immigrant population was due to our sanctions, and we accepted no responsibility for the implosion of their economy, which was caused by us. And I find that full of hypocrisy.
Well, I have to disagree with you. I would say the primary reason that the Venezuelan economy has collapsed are the policies of the Venezuelan government and the incredible level of corruption in the government that has destroyed their economy, one of the most vital economies in South America, rich in resources, rich in oil, rich in gold and other minerals, but it has been totally corrupted. And yes, we do have sanctions on their oil industry, but even that has been waived now in the wake of the war in Ukraine. But no, I mean, I assure you that the cause of Venezuela's problems are not U.S. sanctions. The cause of the problems are decisions they made that those people who rule Venezuela made about their own country. Okay, yeah, that's fine. We do allow that in our country,
Yes,
unlike
yes.
Venezuela. Right?
Yes, John.
Many agricultural employers, hotel employers, roofers, as you point out, depend upon, I can't say undocumented immigrants, but people that appear to be from Latin America. Sure. And they submit their I-9 form with a piece of identification, and everything is fine. Now, however, the bill passed by the legislature, I think it's Chapter 2023-40, Laws of Florida, requires any employer with more than 25 employees to e-verify, which I am told will wipe out a lot of the workers and their ability to work. I'm concerned about what's going to happen to all these people that can no longer find employment. And particularly, what can the church do about it, if anything? I'm deeply concerned that you're going to have a population no longer with the means of support. I don't know what they're going to turn to. Maybe they'll turn to drug sales. Maybe they will turn to theft or something like that. just to get a loaf of bread for their family. Do you have any thoughts about that, or what we might do?
So this is, I told you before that we do very little, or we do almost nothing to prevent undocumented workers from working. And in fact, many industries in the United States depend on these workers. Now, and until 1986, it was not illegal to employ undocumented workers. And in fact, there was a provision in our immigration law called the Texas Proviso that specifically stated it was not illegal to hire an undocumented worker. And that changed in 1986 when we created this system of determining who was eligible to work, and all employers had to request certain documents. Well, what we realized is that, you can make any document you want. And the employers really didn't care, they wanted the worker. So if somebody showed up with a Social Security number or a laminated card and they said it was a visa or a green card, they didn't question it. Who are they to question? They're not immigration experts. But the entire chicken rendering plant has employees who only speak Spanish and who arrived, in the last year or so. So they know. Now, so there was a way that we came up with that said, okay, we will verify their Social Security number. It was called E-Verify. So the employer takes the employee's Social Security number, submits it online, and gets back a response. Is that a real number? Okay, yeah, it's a real number. Okay, this guy's okay. Second, is that number already being used by someone else? So then you have to decide, well, did you used to work in California? Yeah, okay, I moved here. So, okay, you're okay. But if it didn't match, if that number either didn't exist or it was being used by someone else, theoretically, the employer can't hire that person. Now, for years, employers resisted this. They didn't want to know because they needed the workers, and especially now, they need the workers. So in Florida, we introduced this E-Verify. This wasn't the first time. We introduced it. The governor introduced it before, but the legislature said after agricultural interests and the hospitality interests spoke up, they dropped it. They imposed it only for employees of the state government of Florida, which was a minor. But this new law is different. This law says, first of all, it doesn't apply to anyone who's already working. It only applies to new employees. And it only applies, as you say, as far as I understand, to companies that have more than 25 workers. And it doesn't apply to day laborers. So if you're, going out on a street corner and hiring people to work on a construction site, it doesn't apply to you. Well, that eliminates a lot of the undocumented workers. But it's still, if you are a newcomer, if you've crossed the border recently, this potentially could impact you, and it could create a situation where these people have been admitted to the U.S. but now can't work. It's going to be frustrating for employers who need workers to do unattractive jobs and don't have native-born workers to take them. So I don't know how this is going to work out, but it's obviously going to be a problem. It could be that this law is not going to be enforced either. It could be you submit it, but you get the response that it's not valid, but the system isn't 100%. It makes mistakes, and so I suspect that it's not going to be enforced one way or another. It will not be enforced because I don't think that employers in Florida can live with it.
Mitzi, and then we'll close.
Yeah, with the rapid incorporation of AI in all sorts of processes, from businesses to manufacturing to healthcare, there is possibly a potential for oversupply of employees. Apparently, a lot of financial institutions are saying that within 3 years you will have 300 million jobs eliminated because of AI. And that, worsens the problem of what do we do with everybody who's here, legally or illegally,
Well, AI, will that eliminate jobs? That's a good question. Will there be different jobs? I mean, we've seen technological change in our lifetime. I mean, look at computers. Look at how that has changed our world and made us more efficient. Did that eliminate jobs? Jobs have grown. So I don't know what AI will do. But basically, at times when there are not jobs in the United States, the immigrant flows stop. Like I told you during the pandemic, it didn't just stop because of Title 42, it stopped because there were no jobs. During the Great Depression, immigration dropped and many migrants went back home because there were no jobs. When we had the Great Recession in the United States, 2008, 2010, we lost 1 million undocumented immigrants because they went home, because it's a lot easier to live on your meager savings, back in your home country than it is in the United States. And so I think if the number of jobs were to decrease, the pressures for migrating would also decrease.
Interesting. John, what can we do in this country? What are some of the issues there? It's such a complicated issue, immigration. Is there something that is a low-hanging fruit that we could look towards that could be of service to maybe to some of the people who are displaced?
Yeah, I mean, as we look at this immigration problem, I mean, there's been an attempt to come up with the grand solution, very complex legislation involving millions of people, and time and again, it's failed. And my view is that you have to approach this piecemeal and try to get a national consensus on it piece by piece to see which things you can advance. And the thing that I think is the low-hanging fruit is the case of these young people. When I told you that the migrants who were here started bringing their families, and this started when we tightened up the border enforcement after 9/11. So we had many young people brought as children to the United States who've grown up here. They grew up with our children, they went to our schools, they play on our teams, they go to our churches, but they have no legal status. And now they're approaching adulthood, and they are really stuck. And yet, they're really as American as our kids are. And so, in the inability to get legislation, and there were several attempts, there were bipartisan attempts again and again, which failed. I was talking to one of our elected representatives, a member of Congress, and I asked him, would you support normalizing the status of these kids so they could stay? And he says, yes, but not unless we reduce legal immigration. And how would he reduce legal immigration? We would eliminate the right of American citizens to bring their parents and to bring children over 18 when they immigrate. And so I don't know why that is so dangerous to the United States, but in any case, that was his view. Okay, we'll legalize these guys, but you'll have to eliminate not illegal, but legal immigrants. And so there was always a reason for some people not to do this. And on the other hand, there were people saying, this doesn't go far enough. I'm not going to support a half-baked solution. But I think, knowing these kids, having met them, seeing them in our communities, and you wouldn't necessarily know that they weren't documented. They would look just like any other kid going to school. But they're not documented, and they don't have a future. And so in the absence of a legislative decision, under President Obama, he created a program called Deferred Action on Child Arrivals. So basically, it deferred deportation of these young people and gave them the right to work. That has been challenged in the court. A number of states' attorney generals have challenged that, saying that's illegal. He exceeded his authority. He can't do this. It went up, and President Trump tried to cancel the program. Of course, these things go to the courts. The Supreme Court decided that the way President Trump canceled it did not follow due process. There's another suit from those who opposed the program, which is coming to the Supreme Court, that said, the government never had authority to do this in the first place. And, the fate of, 1.5 million young people hang in the balance. So what I would say is that I would like to see if there is a consensus among people of goodwill, our church and other churches, to say, regardless of the other complicated issues with immigration, we should take care of these kids. I mean, what possible reason would we have to get rid of them and just dump them in some foreign country that they've never lived in or can't remember living in? Just at the point where we've educated these people so they can be productive members of our society, we get rid of them? It doesn't make any sense to me. And I know there are other complicated issues, but it seems to me that this is something that we would do. I mean, how could we treat people so cruelly? I mean, as Christians, I spent a lot of my life, trying to enforce immigration laws, and I'm serious about that. But when I look at the situation, I just cannot imagine how we would treat people so cruelly. And so what I would like, and I've talked to people, is to try to get a consensus of people, maybe starting with churches, that says to our leaders, we understand this is a complicated issue, we understand there are a lot of problems, but this is one thing we can do, and this is the right thing to do, and we need to do this now. And so I'd like to keep talking to people in our church and other churches about this idea to see if we're in a position, so we feel confident in going together as clergy and members of churches and say, of all churches, Episcopal, Baptist, Jewish congregations, whatever, and say this is a universal feeling. This is something that we believe in is fair and just, and we should do it.
Well, thank you, John. Let's give him a round of applause. We're just at the beginning of these conversations, but John will be around for a little bit if you have questions for him. If you're interested in looking at allowing young folks who are undocumented, who were born and raised here, to stay, please let me know, and we can approach our local legislature about that. And we may be doing more. This is just a taste test, this conversation. So if you're interested in learning more about these issues, please don't hesitate to let me or John know, and we'll keep listening to the Holy Spirit. All right.
Obviously, this is such a complex issue. I could just scratch the surface on it, but I would be happy to join in a more detailed discussion if there's interest.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we thank you for this time. We thank you for John and his career and his wisdom and the wisdom of the people here gathered. We ask you to show us your will, that we may do your work in this world and welcome the stranger and grow in our understanding of your will for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.